It's really wonderful to have with me on the channel today my friend Daniel Motley, who worked with me here at Logos. I'm actually on my third to last day here at Logos. I'm leaving for Crossway. I'm, for what it's worth, recording before the office day begins at 8:06 a.m. at this point, and you can see Bellingham a little bit in the background. Daniel and I worked together in Bellingham for a number of years. Now he's off onto new ventures and has continued his studies. I actually want to ask him to introduce himself. Daniel, could you tell us what you did at Logos, what you're doing now, and then as an entree into what we're going to do, what we're going to talk about, namely New Testament textual criticism, tell us what you're studying right now. So what you did at Logos, what you're doing now, and what you're studying.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Mark, for having me on. It's a pleasure to get to hang out with friends still from the old days. As you mentioned, I used to work at Logos Bible Software. I worked there for 10 years, nearly 10 years. I came on board starting in May of 2014. Started out as a product promotions coordinator, so I was in charge of choosing all of the products for all of the promotions across Logos, which was fun. By the time I ended my time at Logos, I was the head of the licensing department. And so if there was a book that needed to come on board, if there was a request from customers to bring on a product on the platform, I would go to a publishing partner and negotiate terms and get agreements sent out. And that was my entire team's job. And then I was also in charge of overseeing the base package library building portion every time we had a new launch. So starting with Logos 8, I would help to build all of the library packages, not the software component, but the library of books for each iteration, which was super fun. And of course, you and I spent a lot of time doing podcasts and blogs. And so yeah, a lot of fun times there. And then I left in the end of September of last year, working now for an organization called BiblioNexus. And so it's a nonprofit started in April of 2023. So we're a year in now, but I came in September. And so the goal of BiblioNexus is to resource Bible translators around the globe with openly licensed resources and open access software. And so we have a development team that's working on the software component, and they have two different products they're working on. One called the Aquifer, one called the Bible Well. And then there's the content side, which is where I work. And that's all about resourcing, working with publishing partners to maybe move some of their content into an open license for the use by these folks that are working in majority world countries that usually don't have like a Bible society they're working with. They're just churches wanting to translate the Bible into their heart language. So that's what we're doing right now. And then for New Testament text criticism, so roughly at the end of 2021, I felt a real passion to go back to school. I already have a master's degree from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
You've got an advanced MDiv, as I happen to recall. Isn't that correct?
Oh, that's exactly right. Yes,
Yeah.
It is not written. They didn't put that on my degree, but I do have an advanced MDiv degree from Southern. That's right. And so got that back in 2014. Which I loved my time at Southern. And then at the end of 2021, I just felt a real desire to go back to school. I've always loved learning and just learning more about the Bible, and especially my first academic love, was text criticism. And so I then was looking around for programs, and lo and behold, there was a program near me at a school called Shepherd's Theological Seminary, and with the person there named Andrew Smith, Dr. Andrew Smith, who's working on actually, and we can talk more about this later. He's working in text criticism. And so I said, oh, wow, what a fortuitous thing. And so I've been working there ever since, doing a THM at Shepherd's, and I'm actually now finishing that THM. I will walk next month, actually. And so just finished up so I'm almost done, if you can believe it. So time flies.
Yeah. Now, a THM is often preparatory to a PhD. Is that the plan?
That's currently the plan, Lord willing. So I have a few different options available right now. So it's just trying to figure out what the next good path is.
Yeah. Talk to me about your path into New Testament textual criticism. And I hear the real pros say text criticism, and I've always said textual. Do you have any advice for us on that?
No, it's whatever you say. It's kind of like whenever I worked at Logos. How do you pronounce Logos? It's whatever you feel comfortable pronouncing it as. Right?
I just recorded. I wrote the definitive post, or at least the attempt at definition for that issue, and I just recorded it as a video. We'll see. It might be the last video I do for Logos/Logos.
Yeah.
That's a relief to know that I'm at least not wrong. So talk to us again about your path into it. I remember you had that advanced MDiv, not like you went around touting your advanced MDiv. I just somehow found out about that.
Yeah.
At what point did you realize, hey, this field is really interesting?
Yeah. No, it's a good call. So I think it was probably during my advanced Greek, ironically, my advanced Greek grammar class I had with Dr. Gentry. So like I remember just studying up on my professor, Dr. Gentry, just being really intrigued by what his work was with Septuagint at the time, and then just diving into that, and then realizing like, oh, like there's a lot of fascinating ideas behind the Septuagint and how it relates to the New Testament, but particularly like how the New Testament authors use various readings of the Old Testament in the Greek translation to come up with their exegesis of Old Testament text. And that just led me into like, oh, well, what are these variant readings with the Old Testament? And then all of a sudden, like the floodgates just open up in that way, right? So it kind of led from like New Testament use of the Old Testament into textual criticism from there for me. And even though I'm not on the path of doing Old Testament text criticism. Like that initial discovery of what the variant readings were just kind of led me into that path.
Yeah, I just had Shepherd's professor on the channel, Peter Gaiman, and I was on his channel as well. We were talking about 2 issues of Old Testament textual criticism. And if you know Peter at all, and if you know me at all, these issues have not turned us into liberals. In fact,
Right.
our faith has been strengthened in God's word by giving careful attention to the details. All the same, our faith and our doctrine have been shaped by actually looking at what God has revealed and preserved for us, rather than demanding of God that he do things our way. I had Tim Mitchell here on the channel, and about a year and a half ago, talking about how textual criticism was both a challenge and then a spur to his faith. Talk about that aspect for yourself. Has it ever been difficult as a Bible believer for you to study variants in the Old and New Testament manuscript traditions?
Yeah, I think for most folks, I mean, I probably fall on the same line. Like when you first encounter this, it's a bit of shock to the system, right? Like it's like, oh, like we didn't actually have this book drop from heaven like the Quran, like Muhammad would say for the Quran. Like it actually is there's a transmission history through time that happened. And so I think for me, that was certainly something that was like, oh, but then immediately it was like, well, oh, of course, people had to copy this over time. Like that makes sense. So for me, I think it was less of a oh no kind of moment. I know people have had that. I think Bart Ehrman famously had that kind of experience for himself of like, oh no, this is crumbled my worldview. But for me, it was simply a matter of like, oh, sure, that makes sense. But what do we do with this information now? And then go from there. And that's certainly been, what I've been doing. The nice thing is, and I don't want to put the cart before the horse, is that even in my study doing text criticism in a particular book, it's been amazing to see the transmission history be relative, like pretty stable over
Right,
time. So yeah,
right,
that's been my experience.
right. The irony of the perfect preservation view promoted by King James onlyism and other onlyisms around the world is that what God has preserved for us really is amazingly coherent.
Yeah.
That is, we really don't have massively different texts. We could have that in the Septuagint. We have some of that in Jeremiah, but in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, we have amazingly stable, very good manuscript
Yeah.
traditions.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's talk about the field of New Testament textual criticism. I took my official course in it. Boy, this is like impossible to acknowledge to myself, but almost 20 years ago, I'd say. I was in a class with one other guy and Dr. Sam Schneider at BJU Seminary, and I read a first edition of Westcott and Hort's, Introduction to the New Testament, which is their exploration of New Testament textual criticism, and it was masterful, and actually it was printed masterfully. I had this first edition; it was like so beautiful. I remember reading this book, but I've not really been deeply academically involved in New Testament textual criticism. I've been more skimming the cream off the top. So, as someone who's more deeply involved in this highly detailed and demanding field, what does this field look like right now in 2024? Talk to us about all those acronyms we see floating around: INTF, IGNTP, CSNTM, CBGM, as a way of introducing us to the field of New Testament textual criticism right now.
Yeah. So whenever I first, had my first class in text criticism, in 2022 with Dr. Smith, I came in thinking like, okay, we're going to talk about text types. We're going to talk about all the classical things. And then one of the first things that I encounter when we get in there is just like, actually, text types are out the door now. We are starting to get rid of those. I was like, oh, okay, things have shifted a whole lot since, I took this even 10 years ago, like at Southern. And so, yeah, like one of the things and I can only talk as a student right now, right? Because I'm merely a student and not any kind of expert. But like coming as a student, like one of the things that we encounter is this new model, it's called the CBGM, which is the coherence-based genealogical method of understanding text and manuscripts. To get started there, essentially, it's a new way of relating like the text and manuscripts by using computer tools and data sets. So instead of just looking at one manuscript and just comparing variants, like the goal is to use the entire what's called the digital collation of a text and a manuscript, comparing them with other digital collations and other manuscripts of their text, and seeing how they relate to one another, what their coherence is. And the coherence is simply this idea of like of the agreements between different text and the manuscript. And it's using computer tools and computer models, which is way different again from what I was raised on, as a newly minted master's student back in 2014. So that's where the field is heading. It's digital tools now. It's not merely like you have this idea of this guy, this guy or gal sitting in a library, this musty library somewhere in Europe, digging up manuscripts and just, doing whatever. It's like, no, it's actually like some computer scientist actually now, doing work. And the people who are really pushing forward the field today are folks working in the computer sciences, actually, which is shocking to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit, because that is very alarming to the Calvinistic King James defenders that I have sometimes talked about on this channel, and also to the IFB, Independent Fundamental Baptist King James defenders out there. They say, what? Now we're going to let computers tell us what the text of God's word actually is? So let me have you answer that, and then I've got another question or two for you.
Yeah, I know that the claim that's always made is just like, well, we're just going to have the computers, we're going to run this through an analysis. Computers just going to spit out a Greek New Testament text at the end. I mean, some people think that that's actually what you can do. I would claim that that's not the case. I know people like Peter Gurry would say that that is not at all the case.
And Peter Gurry is an evangelical textual critic that I've interviewed. Yes. He's a friend. Wrote Scribes in Scripture for Crossway. Which is, as of like right now, only $2.99 on Kindle. Maybe that's past, but definitely check that book out. I recommend it highly. And he worked on the CBGM at Cambridge for his doctorate.
That's exactly right. So he's the man when it comes to CBGM, as far as I know. He has a book that I would recommend. I'll go ahead and do that. I was going to do that later, but A New Approach to Textual Criticism. Right here, this book is essential with understanding where the field of text criticism go with regard to CBGM. But anyway, like the idea is not that you can just input this data and it's going to spit out a Greek New Testament. There's still very much the person who understands textual criticism, who understands textual theory, who understands the manuscript tradition, who can then make decisions about where this coherence is going, what direction it's moving in. And again, I'm using terms that are even complicated within themselves, but it's not just a matter of inputting data. It's a matter of people still have to work to do this. We're not going to be able to just use AI, for instance, to just generate a text.
Yeah. So there's a famous statement about textual criticism that I'm not going to be able to quote verbatim, but maybe close. Knowledge of manuscripts should precede judgments on readings. Mm-hmm. And I want to say that came from Hort. I don't know, but I've heard evangelicals and others quoting that repeatedly. And you please correct me. I do not mind being corrected here. I read Gurry's Jets article on CBGM, and I just felt like a stupid dummy. So
if you don't feel like a stupid dummy when you read it, something's gone wrong. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I was like, thanks a lot, Gurry, for introducing me to this topic and just deflating whatever self-esteem I had left. So anyway, that's why we're here, though. I like to popularize these things. You correct me here, but I gather that the CBGM is knowledge of manuscripts that is preceding judgment on readings. Yeah. That is, we need to feed into our computers something that human minds can't quite compute, as it were, can't quite store all of these variants so that we can see where there might be relationships, where some manuscripts are really close to others. And actually, the CBGM, therefore, is not making effectively any judgments
No.
on readings. It is instead informing that like prior step in the process of making judgments about the quality of manuscripts. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say that in a sense. Instead of manuscripts, I would say the text within the manuscript, because
Okay.
it's not making any judgment calls about the manuscript's history, provenance, or anything like that. It's simply saying this text in this manuscript coheres with these texts in these manuscripts at a certain percentage level. And that's
Okay.
very helpful because what that does is that well, I mean, in a sense, it destroys this textual family idea of like Alexandrian manuscripts, Western text manuscripts. Like essentially, instead of text types, we're looking at textual clusters. Like these clusters of manuscripts all seem to cohere at a certain level, and these all cohere to a certain level, as opposed to just saying like, nope, this is an Alexandrian text. Let's put it in this bucket over here. Like we're getting
This
away from
trash
that
bucket.
model.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's Western text. Okay, let's just kick it to the curb. Yeah.
Yeah, I've often had King James only brothers, it's almost always brothers, who are commenting on my YouTube channel telling me it's easy, it's obvious. You get rid of the corrupt, terrible, doctrinally faulty Alexandrian manuscripts and you stick with the Byzantine that agree, completely. And I've just thought, if I stuck a Byzantine quote unquote manuscript in front of you and an Alexandrian quote unquote manuscript in front of you, you couldn't tell me which is which. And I'm not trying to insult you. I always have to follow it up with that. But not only are you having to follow someone else's judgment as to which category, a given manuscript belongs into, you're having to follow very complex judgments made by other people that really you can't repeat or follow as to that whole model that you're assuming, that there are these two lines. Tim Berg and the Textual Confidence Collective and I have, tried to push back against that idea that there are two lines. I like better what you just said about the clusters. Let me ask another question about this here. My friend Dwayne Green, I don't know if you follow his YouTube channel at all, but he's another popularizer. He's more in the Byzantine slash sort of majority. That's not really accurate, but in the majority text world, he uses the New King James at his church. He's a Pentecostal pastor who's got some real interest and knowledge in textual criticism, and he's a friend of mine. He has asked, does it bother you, critical text advocates, that you have a Franken text? That is, you can't look at any manuscript there is and say, yeah, our text matches that. And even within an individual verse, there might be many individual verses where you can't find a single manuscript where all of those judgments that you've made in your critical text match what's in that manuscript. I wonder, given your knowledge of where the field is right now and this discussion you've just given about clusters, how would you respond to that challenge against the critical texts?
Yeah. I mean, my first thing I would say is we're all using Franken texts. Even the text receptus is a Franken text of sorts, right? Unless you are literally using a facsimile copy of a manuscript.
A diplomatic
Everything's
edition, they call it.
That's exactly right. Everyone's using a Franken text, and I think that just undermines what the point is, right? The point is that we're trying our best to get to what advocates of the CBGM would call the initial text, or for me, I would say like the original text of Scripture. So the Franken text, in my mind, is our attempt to know what the words of Paul or Luke or John are. Now, we are also humble. I would say, I'm just making statements on my end. We're also humble enough to say that sometimes we get things wrong, because we are human in that way. But with the way the method goes, it's amazing the amount of certainty I believe we can have, even with these Franken texts, to get to the original text of Scripture. Because again, when I've looked at the textual history, even in my limited time in text criticism, it's amazing to see how consistent the tradition is with regards to the text.
Right.
Even with something like a 9th century manuscript, which I won't get into, it's my thesis, but looking at a 9th century manuscript, even that has a relatively very good, textual transmission history on its own.
Yeah. I think that textual critics, by their nature, tend to make mountains out of molehills.
Yes. Yes.
They
Yes.
find this tiny little teapot and notice it stirring, and they call it a tempest. Well, that's their job.
Yeah.
It's because they have to invest these things with great significance, or they can't spend their lives on them. And they are significant, don't get me wrong. But I argued on an evangelical textual criticism blog post now years ago that we need to make sure that we remember that it's a tempest in a teapot, that when we actually come to the end of the day, where the rubber meets the road, all of the major options are incredibly similar. We're talking about almost always really minor differences, and almost always differences that don't matter, even if it's a translatable difference. The overall difference of the sentence is very, very minor. Let's talk about some of the other major acronyms that structure the field. What's the INTF?
Yeah, the INTF is, I would see them as the central agency of this whole New Testament text criticism effort. So it's the Institute for New Testament Textual Research. They're based out of Germany. They are essentially the stewards of the Nestle Aland text and the ECM, the Edition Critica Maiora text. They're the ones that provide the research and funding that goes into producing these new editions every so often. And so all of the research work that all of these different clusters of folks do to bring their insights into creating new editions, they run through the INTF, which is very helpful.
Should it bother evangelical Christians reading their ESV, their NIV, their NASB, that the formers of the major critical texts, the NA28, are by and large non-evangelicals?
That's a good question. I mean, the problem is that the enterprise itself is made up of a number of different folks in a number of different fields with a number of different backgrounds and beliefs. I think it's always helpful to know where people are coming from, but it's amazing to see how much agreement there is on what the principles of textual criticism should be. And so I don't think it's a matter for those who are working in as evangelicals in text criticism to worry too much. As long as all of our principles are aligned on what the outcome should be and what our input is, I think that we can have good agreement on that front, just like any other endeavor we go into, right?
Yeah. Now, and one of the ways I've answered this, and you just tell me what you think, is that the ESV translators, the NIV translators, the NASB translators, they don't just blindly follow whatever the NA28 says.
No.
That's why we can have in Logos two things. We can have a text that actually mirrors the NIV's text critical choices, just the way Scrivener mirrors the King James text critical choices. We can also have the SBLGNT, which I symbolically removed recently as my top Greek New Testament. As I'm moving now to Crossway, it's now the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. But in the SBLGNT apparatus, it'll say NIV. So here's a place where the NIV translators made a different judgment than other texts. So it's not like we're beholden to what non-evangelicals decide. And if the evangelicals don't like it, well, tough. Right? Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's interesting too, and I one of the things that I often think about when it comes to this, there's a story about John Mills, who's a text critic from a long time ago. I believe he's either 17th or 18th century, and there was a lot of shade thrown at him because he published an edition of the Greek New Testament with all of these variants listed in a textual apparatus.
30,000 of them, right?
Yeah, and people were very upset about it, and I believe it was Richard Bentley who came to his defense and said, these things would have existed with or without him pointing them out. He's merely showing you that these exist. He's not. There's no one's making any judgment call. They're just saying, "Hey, did you know that this existed?" Right. And I think that's very helpful to recognize. Like, even if even if someone comes in who has very bad motives, like as long as they're showing their data and their evidences, like I think it's still helpful to have.
Right. And isn't this, so a follow-on to what you said is another response I've given to folks who are worried that non-evangelicals are touching our text. By the way, everyone who touches any text is a sinner. But anyway, what I say is, unless they are given to conjectural emendations, which is guesses about what the text must have originally said, then they are limited by what readings actually exist in the real world, and therefore, actually, whether they believe in a doctrine of preservation or not, they are following it because they're only using readings that have actually been preserved in history, ultimately, we would say, by providence. Do you think that's an adequate response to those concerns?
I believe so. Like it's interesting that you mentioned even conjectural emendations as well, because even within Old Testament studies, like if you look at the apparatus of the Biblica Hebraica Stugartensia, like there's conjectural emendations made all over the place because in some ways we have to. We don't necessarily have certain. We don't know what readings mean, and so I think the most famous one, Isaiah 53. He will see light. Well, or light didn't appear in anything except for the Septuagint for the longest time. So there was a conjectural emendation that it must have said light there until we found
Really?
until the Dead Sea Scrolls were pulled up, and all of a sudden there existed a Hebrew text that had the word for light that existed, and that conjectural emendation was proven true based on that.
John Mead wrote an article about that
Yep.
for the Bible Study magazine when I was the editor, and I don't remember him mentioning that scholars and editors had guessed the existence of that word before they found it, or
Yeah.
based on the Septuagint. He did talk about the Septuagint, but it's actually in the marginal notations for the Biblica
Now, the
Hebraica
Biblica Hebraica
Stugartensia?
Stugartensia would have already, I assume, would have already had the Dead Sea Scrolls. But from my understanding, there were conjectures made prior to the Dead Sea Scroll findings that it probably said like here because why would the Septuagint have this?
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, very good. Yeah, so I don't like conjectural emendations, as an academic exercise, fine, they can be interesting, but I have a strong enough doctrine of preservation, despite what my King James only brothers think about me, that I would rather stick with, if at all possible, especially in the New Testament,
Yes.
words that
Yes.
have actually been preserved. I'm a little more open to guessing in the Old Testament, partly because of the structure of the language, partly because of the antiquity of it, partly because of the role of Septuagint. I've gone through that in these videos recently with Peter Gaiman. That's really helpful. What's the INTVMR?
The NTVMR. That's the
Sorry. Yes, you're right. I'm
yes.
sorry. NTVMR.
NTVMR, New Testament virtual manuscript room. That is where we actually, as students who are looking and doing transcription work, and that's what our main thing. Me as a student, that's my main thing that I worked on in my textual criticism class at Shepherd's, was creating transcriptions from minuscule manuscripts, so like medieval minuscule manuscripts. And so what we did was we had images in front of us, and we would actually input into this system like all of the words that were in front of us on this page in a nice format. And that way we can then later on, scholars or we can use those transcriptions for the work of the CBGM or for any other work that we'd like to do, which is our main need really right now. There's so the NTVMR is owned or at least hosted by the INTF. And one of the things that they've done is that they actually have a chart that lists out like how many pages of images that they have within the NTVMR. And then how many have been indexed or how many have been edited or then transcribed. And that transcription number is just a micro. It's just so small. Like the work is just astronomical right now. So what we need is more transcribers. We need more people doing transcription work for sure.
We'll get back to that toward the end. I skipped ahead a little bit. Let's make sure to do that because talking about the role of technology and what people can actually do is super important. I thought of the NTVMR because you were talking about the INTF. Let's talk about the IGNTP. What's that?
Yeah, so the IGNTP, International Greek New Testament Project, they're actually like a UK-based text critical organization. There's a number of different council members on there. I know one of them is Hugh Houghton. He's a big name in that. Who's working? They're working alongside the INTF. They're actually picking up the ECM of the Gospel of John. And
Editio
so right
Critica
now,
Maior, which is
that's
what?
exactly right. The Editio Critica Maior, which is I call it the big version of the Nestle Aland text, which is the smaller version, right? So all of the textual criticism work that goes into all of these books, which they've been working on for, oh goodness, like decades
Time out
now.
of mind, right?
Yes, yeah, decades now. So essentially, like all these scholars are working to create nice critical editions of each book of the Bible. And so we've already seen versions for the Catholic epistles, which they included the work from the Editio Critica Maior, the ECM of the Catholic epistles, into the Nestle Aland 28 edition from those insights. They're currently working on John. They released Acts. They've also released Mark. And so they're releasing these nice bound volumes, really nice cloth bound, very expensive cloth bound volumes, but they have the text, a massive apparatus They have all of that content online at the MTVMR website. They've also got textual commentaries, introductions. Like these are the books with regards to like modern text critical studies in any given book of the New Testament.
Yeah. What is an apparatus? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so like a textual apparatus, if you look at your Nestle Aland text, for instance, you've got the text at the top, and then at the bottom you've got the critical apparatus, which is all of the variant readings, and it's selective, right? You can't include, I mean, in theory, one can't include in a print edition every single variant reading from every single manuscript. So what scholars do is they choose what do they consider the most important variant readings, ones that influenced either doctrinal understandings or just meaning understandings of the text that come from different manuscripts.
And therefore, different Greek New Testament editions that have different purposes and audiences will have different apparatuses. Like I loved the SBLGNT for years because for my purposes, number one, I wanted to show loyalty to my employer Logos, and the SBLGNT was put out with Logos, as you know. Number two, I didn't really usually need to be digging into all of the variants that the NA28 was offering me. It was helpful enough for me to have Robinson Pierpont and the NIV and Westcott Hort down there in the apparatus. It was an apparatus of printed editions, whereas the UBS text is for translators, and therefore they're selecting variants that are relevant for them. That's one of the reasons why there are so many different major critical editions that actually get used, because people who know what they're doing are looking for a tool that will help them do it. What's the CSNTM?
The CSNTM is the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. So they're headed up by Daniel Wallace out of Dallas Theological Seminary. Their main goal right now is actually to digitize just all of these manuscripts worldwide. And so if libraries aren't able to do digitization, or they just don't want to themselves, they can bring in Dr. Wallace's group, and they can actually do the scans themselves. I've actually made use of their scans for the Codex Bornerianus because they were the only ones that actually had a scan of the facsimile, because Bornerianus was damaged at a certain time period, and they actually had a scan of the facsimile on their website. So really big shout outs to them. I really appreciate their work, love their work on digitization. They're very much a boon for those of us working with manuscripts.
You know, I have another question that I ought to know the answer to. I've been to the CSNTM offices because Elijah Hickson, one of the members of my little Textual Confidence Collective, was working there before he went to New Orleans to work at a different center on the same in the same field. But I've always wondered and never thought to ask Elijah. Now I'm asking you, do you know why do we need a CSNTM and an INTF? You know, the New Testament Virtual Manuscript Room has tons of manuscripts digitized and put up online and transcribed. Why do we also need the CSNTM?
That's a really good question. So from what I understand about the INTF, for the New Testament Virtual Manuscript Room, Kurt Aland, who was one of the founders of the INTF, he did his darndest to go through and find like microfiche and all of these like images of all of these manuscripts across the world. And so it was a really big concern for him. But then over time, the INTF just focused on simply doing transcription work, and they had a niche thing that they wanted to do. And so really, Dr. Wallace, from what I understand, and hopefully I'm not misspeaking here, but from what I understand, Dr. Wallace really picked up the slack in terms of just wanting to get good digital photographs of these manuscripts. I will say it's incredible to see how, I'm not going to put anybody on blast, but it's incredible to see some libraries, how little they put efforts towards digitizing the materials that are in their libraries. And so I'm very thankful for those institutions like the Center for the Study.
Yeah, in fact, one of my big arguments against King James Onlyism over time, and this harks back to my own experience within it, I got the sense as a teenager that these wicked people are rubbing their hands together with glee, you know, Westcott and Hort. They're dancing around pagan fires, and they are secretly messing with our New Testament. But thankfully, we faithful few, have discovered their dastardly plot, and we're trying to let the whole world know. The actual reality is, I can't think of another field of academic endeavor in which major world-class scholars are doing so much to make it publicly, freely available, all of the information that they're working on. Again, not just taking pictures of countless old documents, that requires real expense and time and traveling to Athens and et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But transcribing them
Yeah.
and then
Yes.
doing various things to communicate their work to the public. So nothing is being done in secret. And how
No.
could it be? It's the
Yeah.
Bible. Everyone's going to know exactly what's going on if you make, quote unquote, a change. And these things get discussed endlessly.
Of all the fields that I've worked in, like New Testament text criticism is very much a you come to field. Like I've always felt open with anybody to say like, oh yeah, you're working on this. Like, yeah, let's come on. Like this is not where no one's trying to keep anything under wraps. Like you want to learn Greek Municipal manuscript, like come on and learn. Like we need all the help we can get, and that's very much this field. This field is not meant to be like some sort of esoteric Gnostic knowledge that's being kept under wraps. This is very much like a you come to type mindset, which I love. It's one of the reasons that attracted me to the field as an academic.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. What are students like you generally working on at the moment? You know, what more work remains to be done? Why are they welcoming you to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the main thing that I talked about earlier was coming in and doing transcription work. So the main thing that I did in my New Testament text criticism class with Dr. Smith at Shepherd's was transcribe First and Second Timothy and Titus in 8 different Municipal manuscripts. So manuscripts that ranged in date anywhere from like I believe 900 to 1600. In time period. And so which was incredible because I got to do a number of things. Number one, I got to actually read a manuscript. You'd be surprised how most folks who have something to say about manuscripts have actually never looked at a manuscript for
Elijah
themselves.
says that all the time.
Yeah. Yes. I know when someone hasn't looked at a manuscript because there's certain things that they just say. But anyway, so that's one of the things that we do is we look at manuscripts and we actually read Municipal. And if you've ever looked at a Municipal manuscript,
it's crazy.
It is crazy. It doesn't look like you're nicely laid out. You really appreciate your Nestle Alon text at that point.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
It's exhausting to even look at these. Oh man.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Tell
so
us why.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they'll do a number of things, right? They'll have abbreviations for for even sentences will be abbreviated in like 2 symbols, and it's just like, what is happening here? So thankfully, I have a buddy named Stephen Young who's actually worked on a ligature tool to be able to help those who are reading Municipal manuscripts to be able to look up like, hey, this looks like this, and he will tell you within this air table, oh, this is what this actually means. So there are tools to help with that.
Okay, dig in. You've got to explain that. Oof. What are ligatures? Why would you need to look up things in an air table?
Yeah. So let's just say that you're a scribe working and you're pumping out manuscripts because you have to write. Well, you're probably going to want to save space and time by simply abbreviating a phrase or a couple of words into like one known symbol, right? So like you think of ampersand for like and, right? Like we know what that symbol means. Well, they use these symbols called ligatures to be able to notate out like certain forms of words. And so like the problem is whenever you as a non-Greek speaking, barely Greek reading person come along and see these, you have no idea what you're looking at. So for me, we needed a tool to be able to quickly decipher ligatures for those of us who are currently not specialists in Greek ligatures, and which is what Stephen Young has done to create a tool for us.
Yeah.
But we have tools at our disposal which weren't available even like 10 years ago, which is incredible. Wow. So it's just opening up more people to be able to do this kind of work. Seminary students or just those trained in reading Koine or medieval Greek can do this work now, which is awesome.
So I think we still use the word ligature in the medical field, and I think it has to do with tying stuff up, like tying off, I don't know, someone's wound or someone's cut. I can't remember. I'm not a medical practitioner, but a ligature is a tying together of letters, often 2, maybe sometimes more. And whereas you're used to seeing a nice little O, an omicron that's in Greek, and a nice little U, which is a upsilon or epsilon in Greek. When they come together, they might tie them together kind of like cursive. And if you have only grown up reading print, or imagine that you've only grown up reading, like I tend to write in all capital letters when I write, because I got that from my dad, and I thought my dad was cool. I still do. And so I've written in capital letters since I was like in 7th grade. If you'd only experienced that and suddenly you encountered cursive, you'd be bowled over. You'd recognize some symbols, but like that S is really so different.
Yeah.
from the regular print S, and
Yeah.
that's what ligatures are in Greek. And the scribes seem to delight in creating new ones. It seems to
They
me
do.
there are just so many of them,
Yeah, and they're
and
usually beautiful. They're really nice
yeah,
looking. They're ornate looking figures. And the thing is, if you're a Greek speaker at that time, like you know what they're writing. It's just that for those of us who aren't, invested in or don't know, understand that, it just takes some time to tease out. And there's some really intricate ones as well, which are my favorites.
yeah. Well, maybe you can send me one or two that I could put on display. We'll see
Yeah, I'll
about
make sure
that.
to. Yeah,
Okay. Talk to me about open source software. You're working
yeah,
in that world for your day job, but when it
yeah.
comes to New Testament textual criticism, what's going on in the development of open source software?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the primary, what I consider an issue right now within like these modern developments in New Testament text criticism is that we are in an in between stage. In that we have a new method by which we are looking at manuscripts, so the CBGM, and the CBGM uses digital tools to be able to do that work. But the problem is that, and this is one thing that I go to Dr. Smith all the time about, or used to, I'd say like, hey, I'm convinced that the CBGM is like the method that I should use as a text scholar to do this. Like what do I do to do this in like John? Like say I want to do this in John. If I have all these transcriptions of John, like how can I do that work? He says, well, there's not really a tool developed yet. Like the INTF hasn't developed that tool yet. Like they've developed it for Acts and they developed it for the Catholic epistles. They haven't developed that tool for John yet. It's like, oh, what a bummer, right? Because I'm sitting here wanting to do that work already because I'm excited. But thankfully, there's people that are working to create a CBGM software tool to be able to like use these transcriptions to be able to do some of that work without necessarily relying upon the INTF, which I'm not putting them on blast at all. They're doing a lot of work right now and they're working on this. It's just that, my desire is just, I want to do it now. I don't want to wait. I want to do it now. Right. And so folks like Joe McCollum is a guy who's been working
Yeah,
in New Testament text criticism for a long time. I'm sure you've known about him, Mark, for
I
a
know him
while.
personally. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a good guy. Like not only is he just extremely knowledgeable about text criticism, he's also an awesome developer. And so he's created what's called an open CBGM to be able, for those of us who want to do that work without necessarily waiting around for the tools to be developed officially. We can actually start to do that now, which is great. And then Joey's been working on that for a few years now, I believe. And the nice thing is that not only Joey, but also David Flood has also been working, and he's currently doing, both of them are doing their PhDs in New Testament text criticism. But David has developed a tool called, I believe, the Apatosaurus. So it's essentially like an apparatus, like you can create your own apparatus using these digital transcriptions that you've done either in the NTVMR or on your own using your own software. You can actually create your own critical apparatus. And from my understanding, and I haven't done this myself, but apparently Joey's OpenCBGM will work in the Apatosaurus. So you can actually do the CBGM work within the Apatosaurus. So people are rising up and starting to create these tools on their own. Now, my only main problem right now, and again, people are working on this now, is that for me as a non-techie person, and this is going to shock those of you who know me from Logos, but I don't actually know how to code. Coding it's not in my gene pool. Like I only do licensing and I know products and I know book covers. I don't know how to code. And so for me as a non-coder, having a front end user interface is really, for me, I think the next step for those who actually want to use good tools. Because right now it's not super user friendly for these things. The Apatosaurus is getting there, but like really we need good front end UI tools to be able to do some of this work. And I think that's the next step. And I'm looking forward to seeing people rise up and do that work.
It's interesting to me. I observe, and please again correct me here if I'm wrong, evangelicals and non-evangelicals work better together in textual criticism than in any
Anywhere
other
else.
field of
I think
biblical
that's right.
studies.
Yep.
Yeah, because it is reasonably objective. Now, some
Yep.
judgment calls need to be made,
Correct.
but even a liberal who denies the inerrancy and even the inspiration of Scripture is able, and I've seen this happen, to describe accurately what Paul is saying in this particular paragraph. So even internal judgments, it's not as if they, non-evangelicals have nothing to say. But in this world where I see evangelicals and non-evangelicals getting along, what if there is some young man or woman who is really interested in this field and wants to get started, wants to put on the yoke and get together with others and actually make a contribution, how can they get started?
That's a good question. One of the things that I would recommend doing is just find a manuscript and just start reading. That would be the first thing I would do. I think just being involved. If you know how to read Greek, just open up Sinaiticus and just look at it.
Yeah.
That's
Yep.
the good thing, right? Getting started there. I
And
think
it's
also
online. And you
it's
can get to
online
it
for
through
free.
Logos. Yeah.
Absolutely the case. Absolutely the case. Yeah. So there's no right now. There's no reason to not do it because you already have access to it. You
It's
have
so
digital
beautiful. Like
access. Yeah.
calligraphically, I absolutely love the
Yes.
major uncials, which is, the
Yep.
all capital letters. Maybe it's because I've written that way myself for all these years, but they're like transportingly beautiful. I'm actually thinking about making a huge poster or even doing it with my laser cutter thing
Yeah.
on wood for my new office that I'm going to be putting together and renting some space, because it's just the shape of those letters I just find to be aesthetically incredibly pleasing. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. A year ago, I had the pleasure of being in London for the London Book Fair for Logos, and so when I was there, I went by the British Library to see Sinaiticus, and that was just such a experience to see something like that in its majesty in person. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
But anyway, but on from there, I think reading the classic works of textual criticism is also the next step. So reading items like, and I have a few books here that I'd recommend. I think starting, even though it's a bit out of date now, starting with the text of the New Testament by Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman is probably a first stop. Number one, it tells you all about how manuscripts were made. It tells you about the important manuscripts and why they're important, and also goes through the history of textual criticism. It just gives you a whole initial wide understanding of the field as it stood by roughly 2004. But it doesn't really talk about the CBGM, and so therefore I would probably then follow it up with this book as well. Again, I did it before, A New Approach to Text Criticism. It's an introductory text. It's a bit heady because it's a lot of new information, but it will help you understand where we currently are, and it's currently the best, as far as I know, the best text for understanding modern New Testament text criticism. And then from there, I would also recommend getting on Facebook. There's a group called New Testament Text Criticism. That's a great one just to go into and just go through and read the posts. There's a lot of people who are knowledgeable within the space. There's a lot of folks that are like working actively within New Testament text criticism. Usually, sometimes groups like that, you get all kinds, and it's not necessarily the most
Right.
helpful folks, but like actually
Right.
these are folks in this group that are actually working in the field, and you will see people interact, which is
Yeah.
good. But the by and
Same.
far and away, I think
Go ahead.
the best place to go would be the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, and also the Text and Canon Institute. Those two right there, I believe, would be the best place sources to go if you were just interested and wanted to get an understanding of where New Testament text criticism actively is and what people are currently now today talking about. I think that's the best places to go to get started.
Yeah. Biblical studies, like any field of academic endeavor, and it isn't merely that, of course, we're talking about the Word of the living God, but it's not less than that either.
Yeah.
It's a conversation that's been going on for a long time, and you need to show that you have done some hard listening before you're going to be listened to.
That's
I
right.
find that a bunch of my commenters, these poor commenters, I dunk on them maybe a little too much, but just like you said, you can tell when someone's never looked at a manuscript. I can tell when someone doesn't know the difference between a manuscript and a printed edition. And it's difficult. It's difficult to make myself listen when they have just proven that they haven't made themselves listen to really the most basic aspects of the field. But that's one of the reasons I have these interviews and these discussions here on the channel. It's to help acquaint people with the basics. And I think another big part of it really is just to show that evangelical folks who believe in the gospel, who believe in the Bible, who say, as I often do, Lord, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. We are actively involved in this field. And I remember, the Pensacola Christian College now 25 years ago put out these videos in which Dell Johnson was their spokesperson. He was working with Theodore Leadus, is his name you'd probably know. And he said that textual criticism is criticizing the Bible. Well, that is an open misrepresentation. That was utterly irresponsible.
Yeah.
And you can see, here we are, evangelicals who love the Lord, love the Bible, who've given our lives to it, and we're involved in this field, and it's not anything to be afraid of. In fact, it's really just collecting the best ideas that we can for how to handle the situation God has given us, in which He's not given us specific direction in how to choose among the major textual variants. Well, Daniel, thank you for popping in here and chatting with me. Thank you for the work that you've done here, and may the Lord bless the work that you still have to do in this field.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. It's always a pleasure chatting with you, brother.